This particular project grew out of a conversation that I had with an archaeologist associated with the Museum of Tropical Queensland. She alerted me to problems with coral taxonomy and a desire to work out where corals might have been collected. In 2022, I published an open education resource called Beyond Cook, and that really opened my eyes to how many Explorer journals have been digitised. They're available online, they're open access, but unless you know where to look for them or you have a sense that they're out there, you don't necessarily find them. Beyond Cook brought together the links for those. People can go through that resource and read the original Explorer journals. This project is going to extend that even further. So people will be able to look at the map, look at particular parts of the map and see who went to a particular place, and then link through to those journals, those digitised journals, and extract the information that they need from them. This is really exciting because, again, it breaks out of those barriers between different voyages and between different empires and lets us get a better view of what was happening in terms of culture contact in any particular place and who was there. Mapping explorer journeys is difficult even beyond the difficulties of standard historical data and how people record where they are and what they're doing. The explorers are constantly recording where they think they are, but they're never quite sure. We've resolved that issue in this project by only mapping the points at which they touch known land points. So we're mapping journeys between ports, between harbours. It's not ideal, but it means that we can be certain where they were at various times. It brings its own quirks though, because names shift over time. And one of the things that might emerge from this process, and something that I'm aware of from my own work, is that naming places is political. I'm a New Zealander, I'm aware that the old names are coming through again, and that's something that's happening around Australia and starting to occur across the Pacific as well. We need to think hard about what names we are going to be putting on these maps and how we link back to that history of naming.
I think this is a fantastic project that will actually mesh both our hard sciences, our biology, and also bring our cultures and histories together into one project to tell a broader story about the Coral Sea, the Great Barrier Reef, coral collection, and the history of seafaring around this area.
We've really had to try and understand where these specimens were collected from, and sometimes this is quite obscure literature, so trolling through ship's logs and things like that, and this is certainly something I never thought I'd be doing as a marine biologist, and also something that we've never been trained to do. So fortunately, working at the museum, I was able to reach out to some colleagues in the humanities department at the museum, and then that's gone through to colleagues at JCU, and we've developed this quite extensive project trying to understand the history of, I guess, natural history collections in Australia, but also in the South Pacific. That's been a really interesting part of the project.
Our main aim is to make it easier for humanities researchers to create digital maps without having to have a big grant or lots of funding or hire software developers and that sort of thing. Sometimes with these things, a lot comes down to critical mass. So that depends on people having put information in there. The way to get up to that point, though, is to still make it useful for every individual project. So one of the incentives for using it is that you can very easily create a map for your project. You can share that map with people. It's very good for engagement with your research and so on. You can embed it in your website. But once that information starts to combine, then you can start seeing how those different layers might have interact and discover new things.
My interest is in how histories are very, very layered. So there are legal, political, social, economic aspects, all related to each other within one history. And the Coral Discovery Project mixes them all together and brings out how they were historically connected, but also how understanding these elements better contributes to all sorts of different fields within history.
Looking at where things might have been collected and looking at who might have done the collecting of them, we can start to get a picture of how particular specimens ended up in particular European collections. I knew there were limited numbers of places that ships had actually visited, and I'm aware too of the science networks that underpin those voyages, that the naturalists on board the vessels aren't necessarily of the same nationality as the funding government or as the captain. And so there are networks that these things feed into. We're not limiting ourselves to one voyage, we're not limiting ourselves to one European empire. We're going to see all these voyages and where they went across the Pacific and around the coast of Australia.
I think the fun thing is that we don't really know what will come out. We don't know what it's going to look like a year down the road when many people have contributed to it. And what I think is that it will be a very interesting, thought-provoking visual tool that will get students thinking about the reality of those explorations, but also will trigger a lot of questions in colleagues, scholars, students, many different people, many different audiences.
What I find is really important about maps is the way they connect people to information through this visualisation of data. And in this project, the Coral Discovery Project, that's entirely what this is about. It's about connecting people with new information associated with ship journeys and corals through visualisation.
My interest is in shipwrecks and seafaring in the early 1800s towards the 1900s in Australia and the Great Barrier Reef. So for me, this project may actually uncover hidden information about shipwrecks or people seeing shipwrecks or survivors that we don't have access to now.
I've also got some ideas about how I will use it to look at the introduction of species to particular places in the Pacific. What ships might they have come on? When might they have arrived? And what do the later voyages say about what they can see? In creating the data sets for this project, I've become aware of how significant Cook's journals were to later explorers, and that's something I'd like to pick up as well. And with the mapping project, I'm becoming even more aware of the way that longitude remained an ongoing project even after the invention of the chronometer, and how these voyages still struggled. After Cook's voyages, they still struggled to know exactly where they were, and that's an interesting challenge to think about. While we're focusing this project on the explorers and drawing material from the explorers' journals, this is important as well for thinking about the view from the land of these expeditions coming through, because it's going to be possible to look at a particular place and see who arrived when. We're going to get a better idea of what people on the land were seeing and what the engagements between local people and these vessels coming through were like. The explorers' journals are amazing sources for a distorted but intriguing view of island societies and of Australian societies at a particular point in time. This will allow us to better patch together those reports and to get a sense of what it was like for people on these islands, in these places, encountering Europeans and encountering them as a sequence of voyages.
I guess one of the important things about, how this relates to, current concerns about museum practices, we're trying to identify the corals that were described from Australia. And one of the problems is that, this relies on these old specimens. Most of those specimens are not in Australia. Most of them are in London or sometimes Paris or other places. And so, this has been one of these big problems, is that, it really reflects the colonial history of Australia and how, most of the species that were described from here, and now there's rules about if we describe new species from Australia, these specimens need to be deposited in Australian museums. But the fact is that's relatively recent. So for 200 years, all the things that were described from Australia are not here. And so that's really important from a museum perspective, but also I've increasingly learnt working with traditional owners that they feel ownership over these items as well. That these are part of family and really important, and they're not even in museums in Australia. They're not they're overseas.
James Cook University is the perfect place for this project, in part because it's amusing that we're looking at explorers at a university named for an explorer, but also because we have small disciplines at James Cook University, which means we are already interdisciplinary in the way that we function. I know my colleagues in other disciplines. We talk about the different things they're interested in and the different tools they use. As a result, this project is pulling together people from environmental science, from coral taxonomy, from anthropology, from archaeology, and of course, from history.